And thanks to all of you who are out there listening. Uh, this topic, of course, is very near and dear to my heart because, uh, to be clear, I am a pacifist. I do not believe that violence solves anything. And even though oppressed people like the Palestinians have the legitimate right to use armed resistance if they choose. I have always argued that it would not be wise for them to exercise their rights and that nonviolence is a far more effective and efficient method for their liberation than armed struggle. For one thing, I don't think we can out-violence the Israelis at all. Uh, God forbid that we have enough firepower to out-violence the Israelis. That would be horrendous. One of the things that a few people understand about Palestinians and Palestinian resistance is that it has always been primarily nonviolent. We really have not been very good at armed struggle. But we have perfected the language and the rhetoric of armed struggle. We have the language, the poetry, the glorifying the gun and the resistance in its armed force form. But we really haven't been very effective as a military operation. Way back, even in the early 20s, with the revolt, the 6-month revolt against colonial British occupation at that time and colonialism. I think October 7 was almost an anomaly in Palestinian resistance. And I have to say this carefully because I'm a pacifist, but it was first and foremost a brilliant military operation. It breached in 40 different places simultaneously the most sophisticated electronic and physical wall around Gaza. The Palestinian fighters with very basic handheld weapons actually captured 2 military bases, killed about 340 soldiers by Israeli count, and captured about 50 or 60 others to take them as hostages and exchange them for Palestinian prisoners. But they also attacked civilian targets like that music festival and the kibbutzim around Gaza, which was, of course, I believe, illegal and a war crime to target clearly civilian objectives. So for Palestinians, this was a rare moment of actual violent military opposition to the occupation. I know people will be very upset because they will claim that Palestinians have always participated in armed struggle, but the record will show that our efforts at armed resistance have always been very sporadic, very minimalist, not well organized, not well equipped, no brilliant strategies, campaigns, no effective military struggle. But our nonviolent struggle has been going on all the time without claiming the mantle of nonviolence. Most Palestinian actions have been protests, raising the flag itself an offense, referral to international tribunals, particularly the United Nations, boycotts. Boycotts have always been part of the Palestinian resistance. The organizing alternative methods of resisting, demonstrations galore, every form of strike, all of which are non-violent, really, but never claimed the language or the mantle of nonviolent resistance. We have always glorified the gun and the armed resistance, but we've actually been practicing nonviolence. The first Intifada, as you probably are very well aware, has been largely nonviolent and deliberately so. Yes, they still used stones and occasionally knives, but it was largely nonviolent and deliberately intended to portray a message that we really wanted to get rid of the occupation. The vast majority of the activities took place in the occupied territories, not within the pre-67 Israeli borders. And as I said, almost never used what's called hot weapons, firearms and bombs, but mostly stones, protests, occasionally knives, and one of the greatest proponents of nonviolence, open proponents of nonviolence, Dr. Mubarak Awad, was actually deported just at the very beginning of the Intifada, even though his writings and many of the things that he has suggested, including planting olive trees, using alternative methods to reduce reliance on the Israeli economy, boycotting Israeli goods for which there is a local alternative, and other forms of resistance were actually very common during the Intifada. To come back to Gaza, because this is actually what we are talking about today. Not many people are aware that one of the biggest attempts at nonviolent resistance was the Great March of Return, where the Gazan people openly and deliberately tried to approach the fence and were actually mowed down. On one day, 62 people were killed, non-violently walking towards the fence. They were all shot and killed. This continued over several weeks with the Israelis in a very calibrated fashion, either deliberately trying to wound people or deliberately trying to kill them. I could almost spot the times when they suddenly decided to start killing the health workers and the journalists, because they didn't start to do that from day one. They were just targeting the individuals. In fact, the Israelis said, "We know where every single bullet is going." The snipers were very professional and deadly in killing innocent, totally non-violent Palestinians who were approaching the wall, calling for a return. After all, 2/3 of the population of Gaza are in fact refugees. And the kibbutzim that they had attacked eventually were actually built on their stolen property. And when Hamas managed to tear down that fence around them, many of them walked in the first time in their lives that they have been able to re-enter Palestine and to go back, if only for a few hours, to their ancestor homeland and to their properties, actually, and to their land. Of course, the Israeli response was immediate, brutal, and continuing to this day. In fact, it was so thoroughly genocidal that many people have even claimed that the Israelis allowed October 7th to happen in order to provide the justification for the ongoing genocide and ethnic cleansing of Gaza. I don't prescribe to that particular theory, but in fact, the shock to the Israeli system, the Israeli army, their security apparatus, their vaunted technological superiority was tremendous. For I don't know, 6 or 12 hours, there was almost no response. They didn't know what to do. Few helicopter gunships started killing indiscriminately any car that was going back to Gaza, killing, of course, many Israelis who were being taken as hostage, as well as killing many Palestinians. So what happened again, I want to say, was probably one of the first major Palestinian armed actions against Israel and its takeover of Palestinian lands. One of the reasons why it achieved and created so much support for violent resistance was not only because it clearly was initially at least, a successful major military action against Israel, but also because the alternative that was being presented to armed resistance was so much hated and so much ineffective. People were not being offered nonviolent resistance as a method or as an alternative to armed resistance. Instead, they were offered the Oslo process. They were offered negotiations which were very unequal. They were offered an alternative of actually normalizing the occupation and having Palestinian leaders act as subcontractors on behalf of the occupation, keeping their own people down and preventing actual liberation. So many people rejected nonviolence, not because they rejected the principle of nonviolence, they rejected the Oslo process. They rejected the Palestinian Authority. They rejected this ongoing process of fragmentation of Palestinian society. They rejected the siege against Gaza. They rejected the process by which violence was a monopoly of the occupier, of the oppressor. And they were simply supposed to either accept it or appeal to international community and international law, which was generally ineffective and which was plagued by double standards, which were obviously highlighted, especially by Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and the robust Western response to that particular invasion and attempted annexation of Ukrainian territory into Russia. So many people said international law doesn't work, international public opinion doesn't work, polite, nice nonviolence doesn't work. Therefore, armed resistance is the only alternative open to us. So here I must again emphasize that for me, when I speak about nonviolent resistance, I'm not talking about an easy option. I'm not talking about simply refraining from using violence and weapons. Nonviolent resistance is a very robust, active campaign that requires as much, if not more, discipline than armed resistance, and certainly that entails sacrifices, and certainly needs to be a continuing campaign and not just a one-off activity. You can't just say, Well, we tried it. The Great March of Return failed because it was met with such brutal repression, and because of the sophisticated wall, the automated machine guns that would shoot at anything that moves anywhere near the border. Because of the silence of the international community, we tried it, doesn't work. We go back to armed resistance. I always tell my friends that armed resistance also hasn't worked very well. That it's a continuing long-term process that is required for Palestinian nonviolence to work and achieve its objectives. Somehow, nonviolence has always been misunderstood, not only in the Palestinian context, but in other contexts as well. Because at some level, it is counterintuitive. Our bodies are trained to think in terms of fight or flight. We either fight or we run away. So if we don't fight, somehow we are viewed as cowardly and as complicit and as failing in the job of liberation, which we are about. I don't view it that way at all. Nonviolence is a very deliberate, active, necessary, costly, definitely costly method of fighting for liberation, but which I continue to maintain is the best option for those who are fighting, as the Palestinians are, for their freedom. So I think I will stop here because my time is up. But I am very curious to hear the questions of my friend Andrew, as well as the audience.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. You've made a very persuasive and eloquent case for nonviolent resistance. I'm afraid most of the audience who might be expecting a confrontational interview with you now on the style of typical television shows is not going to be very much hearing what they want to hear. They won't be able to appeal, because I agree philosophically very much with what you had to say. So I'm going to start off with a question that you must have been asked many times before, but it's one that's always bothered me. Why is it that the Palestinian leadership, whether under Abu Ammar or Abu Mazen, has never fully endorsed nonviolent resistance as a tool, even in those cases where the examples were relatively small of protests against the West Bank wall of separation barrier? They never got backed, and often they were broken up by Palestinian security forces. Could you explain this?
Well, two reasons. One of them is because they misunderstood what nonviolence means. They thought it meant surrender. They thought it meant giving up. They thought it meant an alternative to the methods that they were using, which were negotiations. And they said, we are the ones who are negotiating. We're the ones who are nonviolent. Who are these people? They are just disrupting what we are doing. But the second is because they also were caught up with the rhetoric of violent resistance. If you remember the slogan of the first Intifada, even though it was largely nonviolent, was لا صوت يعلو فوق صوت البندقية. No voice shall be raised above the voice of the rifle. It is the gun, it is the rifle that speaks, which is a very strange slogan for a campaign that was largely nonviolent. I keep repeating that all the time. Part of it, I think, is the nature of the Arabic language. The Arabic language has always used violent metaphors. I'll drink his blood. I mean, I drink his blood. Awful. Or my kid misbehaved and I gave him a beating, half of which is death. ضربت قتل نصها موت. You don't say I will hit you, you say بدبحك, I will slaughter you. This is language. The Arabic language, unfortunately, is full of very violent metaphors, which get translated into English and broadcast by the other side. Says, look how barbaric they are. They're talking about drinking our blood. They're talking about making the earth burn under our feet. They're talking about utterly slaughtering us. And that's language. That's language you use with your own children, with your own colleagues. It is in Arabic, by the way. The word exaggeration and the word rhetoric come from the same root. It's balagha and mubalagha.
Mm,
So to exaggerate is to be eloquent.
mm.
And it doesn't translate well into English, but it turns us into to appear to be very barbaric and very violent when in fact we are not.
That's a very enlightening explanation. So, in the context of today, with the popularity that Hamas has gained in the West Bank, certainly, perhaps not in Gaza itself, for its actions on October the 7th and subsequently, do you feel that nonviolent resistance still has a place to play today and should be revived again? Do you see sources of hope, inspiration that this could be used again as a tool?
Absolutely, more than ever. In fact, very naively, on October 7, I had the hope that this would be a breakthrough, that by showing that with every possible technological and military advantage, you cannot keep a people down. That a totally besieged, totally surveilled, totally controlled population still had the creativity to come up with something that really undermined the entire Israeli military and security doctrine. I thought, wow, maybe the Israelis will wake up. Maybe, especially with so many hostages having been taken, they will now start negotiating with Hamas. They will start dealing with Hamas. They will start looking for other alternative other than total military superiority, because it's clear if Palestinians were able to do this after 15 or 16 years of siege, then they will always be able to come up with a surprise. There will always be another October 7. There will always be resistance, and you will never be secure. Security for you cannot be found just by military might. It must be found by peaceful negotiation and settlement of the dispute. So for the Israelis, this was a missed opportunity, I think. Instead, they doubled down on violence and more destructive violence than ever before. But for Palestinians, I think the consequences also have been horrendous. I think they realize they're dealing with an enemy which will stop at nothing, that ethnic cleansing and genocide can be practiced even with the whole world looking on, and that therefore we must find a different way, a different solution. We must find this has to be resolved. It cannot just continue on a path of simply out violencing the other side. It's not going to happen.
Well, I agree with you philosophically, and I wish you were right. Jonathan, you know that the situation on the ground is very different indeed from what it was during the First Intifada. During the First Intifada, there were many Israeli targets, soft targets of the civil administration that were present, which one, as Palestinians, could react against or resist against. From something as simple as not renewing the license plates on your cars or refusing to cooperate with the civil administration over documentation. Today, that's not the case. Israelis are present only when the IDF makes a raid or they're there in their own settlements. But here, I think, is where there is a potential opportunity, if it could be seized, in order to be able to practice real nonviolent resistance, if people had the courage to make the sacrifices that you spoke about and to maintain a sustained campaign. and that is over withdrawing labor from working in the settlements. Because, as we all know, the settlements depend very heavily on Palestinian manual labor to be able to make it possible. If they withdrew their labor, they stopped working there, it would make a big difference indeed. Now, clearly there would be financial sacrifices and people are in difficult financial situation. But if there were to be a scheme whereby they could be compensated, let's say by a Gulf country, for example, which would agree to be able to support a campaign of nonviolent resistance by making sure that those who lost their employment as a result would be financially maintained in other forms. Is that something that you think provides an opportunity for us to revive the idea of nonviolent resistance?
Now we're going into tactics. And in fact, the Israelis are working very hard to provide alternatives. For example, for workers in Israel, they're bringing agricultural workers from Thailand to substitute for Palestinian labor. They will probably try to do something like that in the settlements as well. But more importantly, you raised a position, again, a tactical position. One of the ways that nonviolence works is in creating those situations where there is contact and tension between the occupier and the occupied, the oppressor and the oppressed. So Israel is trying to find technological alternatives or responses. In fact, the wall that they created around Gaza was precisely to prevent that direct contact between Israeli soldiers and the Palestinians. One would argue that the creation of the Palestinian Authority itself was an attempt to reduce contact directly between the occupiers and the occupying population. So the Israelis are constantly thinking of alternatives to prevent Palestinian nonviolence, but ultimately they're not very good at it because their inclination is always to go to violence. Violence for them is the first option rather than creatively avoiding points of contacts and tension. And so I think Palestinians need to become creative and to think of different ways. One of the most effective ways of Palestinian nonviolence is BDS, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. Sanctions, for example, talks about international law, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, boycotts of sports activities, cultural activities, etc. Boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, I think, are extremely effective form of nonviolence. And you have to remember that Israel is really a very small country that is totally and completely dependent on Europe and the United States for everything, from sports to culture to science to education to health to, never mind, to military and financial and diplomatic support. So if BDS takes root, if the people of the world, in the face of this horror of genocide, decide they don't want to participate in it and they want to put an end to it, all they have to do is use non-violent forms of withholding support from this state of Israel. Right now, the United States and to a lesser degree Europe is providing Israel with this huge umbrella of protection from basically responsibility, from consequences of their action, providing them not only with military and financial support, but most importantly with political cover for apartheid, for genocide, for oppression, for occupation. And I think if Palestinians can manage to use that, that will be the best and the easiest and the most nonviolent path towards a peaceful reconciliation. Yes, Palestinians have to bear the brunt of the occupation in the meanwhile, and right now they are doing that. But the response cannot just be violence. Again, we cannot out violence the Israelis. To do that, we need nuclear weapons. We need much more massive, destructive force, and that is not a path that I think we should be seeking.
Yeah, well, you pointed to some of the targets for resistance, for nonviolent resistance, particularly sporting and cultural activities, which I share your view that these would be effective if there was a genuine mass refusal to engage with, and particularly those that are working from the settlements. Do you feel that there might be a generational issue at work here, which perhaps is affecting the popularity or appeal of nonviolent resistance? Is it seen as something that's outdated or passé, that young people might be looking for new forms of struggle that perhaps doesn't encompass a direct confrontation with Israelis?
Very much so. Very much so. You can see it among younger people very vividly. The sad thing is because they place nonviolence in the basket of failed policies, in the basket of the PA and its collaboration with Israel, in the basket of Oslo agreement and compromises and basically surrender, while they place armed resistance in the opposite camp. So as Palestinians get, especially the youth, are thoroughly frustrated with Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority and the Oslo process, instead of turning to genuine nonviolent resistance, they turn to armed resistance and to Hamas. This is one of the saddest things that I observe. But there's very clearly a generational divide. Very clearly, young people are fed up. They think that the older generation has failed them, that the methods of the older generation don't work, and they need something new.
Jonathan, I'm not going to abuse my time anymore, so let's hand over to Diana, who's been collating the questions that have been coming in, and devote the rest of the time to what others who are following this program want to hear.
Thank you. You touched on something, both of you. One of the questions that had come up in lots of different forms was what forms of nonviolent resistance do you recommend using? And you talked about BDS and sporting events and so forth. So I just wanted to say I won't be going into those questions, but thank you for asking them, everyone. I've had one come in from Canada, so it's asking specifically about Canada, but I'm going to expand the remit because to cover the UK and the States as well. Actually, it's one from, I believe, Alan Gordon. Is it a non-violent response to shoot down the drones attacking peaceful Palestinians? And if so, why is this not happening? I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Well, drones are very new method of warfare. They are really modernizing and weaponizing automated technology, including AI. I think that the weapons of automated robots shooting and killing and even selecting targets, as in the Lavender Project and Where's Daddy, is really horrible for all of humanity, not just for the Palestinians. These are weaponized robots who are attacking us. So do you stop weaponized robots with nonviolence, or do you shoot them down? This is a new question, I think, for the theorists of nonviolence. But generally, nonviolent practitioners have viewed attacks on inanimate objects as being fully permissible for nonviolent activists. If you put paint or if you try to destroy nuclear weapons or nuclear facilities without hurting human beings, that is generally viewed as a legitimate nonviolent tactic. I don't think nonviolent activists are sufficiently sophisticated and have weapons to shoot down drones as of now. I'm certainly not going to try and get some military training on how to shoot down uh, robots. But this is actually it's interesting. What's happening in Gaza is being viewed by many people as a as an experimental place where Israel is battle testing its new technologies and selling these weapons to people all over the world. Everything from face recognition to the Pegasus system of hacking into phones to hacking into pagers where you can blow up your enemies to these sophisticated drones and automated machine guns. It is a horrible new world that Israel is introducing us to. Nonviolence begins elsewhere. Nonviolence begins by saying that the oppressor needs soldiers to oppress you. Soldiers have a heart, have a mind. You can engage them. You can get them to change. You can neutralize, not in the sense of killing. Israelis use the word neutralize to mean kill, but neutralize their violence, if not win them over to your cause. Uh, but if the enemy uses totally inanimate robots to kill and shoot and bomb and control your population, I don't know what the nonviolent response to that would be. It's a very good question, whoever asked it. Thank you
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you. We've got a very honest comment and question from the Archbishop Patrick Kelly, one of our dear supporters. He says, at one stage, I lost sympathy for Ukraine because of double standards between response to Putin's land grab and decades of injustice experienced by Palestinians. But pondering President-elect Trump's words and selection of cabinet, I now fear in equal measures for both theaters of war. I fear a deal maker and what he will expect Palestinians to put on the table. Is this too bleak an assessment?
No, it's not.
No.
Trump's choices for ambassador to Israel, for the defense minister, for key positions have been really horrible individuals who don't give us much hope for the future. Uh, when he was campaigning, part of his campaign was, I don't like war. It's the Democrats who are starting war, who are selling weapons. I want to stop these wars. I want to stop the war in Ukraine. I'm going to stop the war in Gaza. We don't, America first means we don't spend all our money and weapons being involved in other countries. Sounded good, but sounded very unrealistic, frankly. The United States has soldiers in about 150 different countries now throughout the world. I can't imagine Trump or any other president effectively putting a stop to the military industrial complex. Uh, but what is he going to do with Palestine? What is he going to ask Palestinians to do? Maybe erase themselves, stop calling themselves Palestinians, migrate elsewhere to the Sinai Peninsula or to Jordan or somewhere else, give up any hope or any claim to a homeland or to a state of their own, give up on justice, give up on equality. It's also unrealistic. I mean, how can Palestinians give up? It's not going to happen. The first Intifada was strange because there was nobody to surrender to the Israeli occupation. So Israel had to shift policies and bring in Yasser Arafat and the PLO and the whole Oslo process as a way to find somebody to deal with. In Gaza, they have a problem now. They don't want to deal with Hamas. They don't want to deal with the PA. They don't want to even deal with UNRWA. So how are they going to rule Gaza? They were talking about finding some paid company to run Gaza, a paid security agency to run Gaza. It is very disheartening what Trump may come up with. We know he came up with the Abrahamic Accords, and at that time, everybody, any expert in the field said that's a non-starter. What do you mean? This is like a crazy right-wing dream of how to solve the problem. Somehow, if we close down UNRWA, there will be no more refugees. Well, there will be refugees. They just won't have a relief agency to deal with their needs. I really don't know what Trump and his appointees are going to come up with, but I share the fear, the trepidation, the worry that nothing good is going to come out of it.
Before you go on, Diana, I would like to add a footnote. I share Jonathan's forebodings, but I think we need to try to be positive without being Pollyannish or foolish about how it could be. Realities might intervene to be able to affect the calculations in practice of the new officials once they're in power and once they realize what they're going to have to deal with. Secondly, and this is more a hope rather than a realistic prospect, but I would like to believe that the important Arab states, the neighboring states, as well as the Gulf countries, could take stronger positions in order to be able to come up together. They are discussing among themselves how to respond. So if they were to take stronger positions that would challenge the underlying premises of what we expect to be the Trump administration's policies towards this particular conflict, then I think that they have some leverage that they could use, particularly Saudi Arabia and the Emirates.
Thank you for that. I have a question from Kate Cargan. What about Israeli peace groups? Is there a possibility with collaborating with them? What is their view or approach on nonviolent resistance?
Yeah. Well, Israeli peace groups have been totally undermined by the United States. Their basic argument to their fellow countrymen was, we can't do this. America won't allow us. The world won't allow us. And they've been laughed at because America did allow us and did support these groups. So Israeli peace groups have been dwindled, shrunk to almost insignificance in Israel today. But they are definitely the core of the possibility for a future peace. Again, it's really interesting, but the West doesn't really understand what's happening inside Israel. The discussion within Israel, and I follow it on Israeli television in Hebrew on the internet, is totally different than the discussion you hear internationally. Israelis are really worried about their future. They really don't think that they will be allowed to continue with this policy. They really think that they are going to be at some point abandoned, and they actually worry whether Israel is going to survive the next 10 or 20 years beyond that. Because right now they are in this full military mode. but they realize it cannot give them security. They realize at some point they're going to have to stop and they're going to have to deal with the question, and they have no idea how to do that. I think that those who really care about the Jewish people in Israel would want them to move quickly towards a peaceful solution. Those who see that the two-state solution is being made impossible have to start thinking seriously about the one-state solution. Can we have a single state in all of Palestine? In fact, it can easily be argued that we already do. The question is, what kind of state? Is it going to be a Jewish supremacy state, or is it going to be a democratic state with equal rights for all its population? Which I believe it is going to be, it is going to have to be. That's the best way for survival and for thriving for both Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs. I've already written about that, beyond the two-state solution. Maybe if you can put that in the chat box, people can download that vision of mine, which is available.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. I will include those links when I send the email out with the recording of this event. And please do share this event. Did Hamas expect the totally unrestrained response of the Israelis?
Sorry, it was jumbled. I didn't hear your question again. Your voice was jumbled.
Marvin Russell, did Hamas expect the totally unrestrained response of the Israelis after the 7th of October incidents?
I think Hamas expected a massive response, yes. The level of response, I don't think anybody expected. I don't think Israelis expected it. In fact, they expected that after a few weeks they will be stopped by the international community. They ran out of ammunition after the first month because they dropped everything they had. I totally blame the U.S. administration for giving them both the wherewithal, the ammunition, but also the protection from international liability and accountability. I don't think the Israelis expected to be allowed to continue for over a year in an open campaign of ethnic cleansing, of totally trying to get rid of the entire population. I think Israelis would have liked to move them all into Sinai, but the Egyptians simply couldn't allow that. The Egyptian army wouldn't accept it, and then Sisi wouldn't accept it. I think I heard reports that Blinken, during the first month, actually talked to the Egyptians and the Jordanians to take in 1 million Palestinians each, drive them into Sinai and drive them into the East Bank. And these countries said, no, we cannot do it. You will lose, the regime itself will fall. So I don't know that anybody expected the level of actual physical destruction and genocide that we see now. But Hamas, I think, did expect a really massive response. And at some level, they were prepared for it. I don't think anybody expected it to last for a whole year.
Andrew,
Diana,
do you have a comment?
Go ahead, Diana, please.
I just wanted to ask Andrew if you had a comment on this.
What I want to comment on is a question that I saw pop up in the chat box, because I think it's a very important one, and I'd like to hear Jonathan's view on it as well. It was a suggestion that for nonviolent resistance to be successful, it requires training and tactics. I agree fully with that myself, and you are a professional in this field. It doesn't happen just spontaneously. It needs to be a form of resistance that is carefully targeted and is sustained over a period of time. And that, I would humbly suggest, has been largely lacking up until now. We have not had, at least in the Palestinian context, we've not seen it sustained as an organizational tool. But perhaps I'm wrong, Jonathan.
No, you're absolutely right. We haven't had a sustained, organized, funded, principled training, discipline. You see, people really don't understand nonviolence. They think it just means you do one activity, and if it fails, we tried nonviolence, we go back to violence. It's like armed struggle. It doesn't happen just with one battle or one campaign or one event. And it requires, there are losses, there are gains, there are sacrifices to be made, there are resources to be dedicated to it, there's training. It has to be a continuing campaign. Actually, some studies were done about attempts to get rid of undemocratic or oppressive regimes, comparing those that were done with violence and those who were done with non-violence. There was a study that showed that your chances of success if you use violence are uh, 50-50, of non-violence are 50-50, and if you use violence, your chances of success are 30%, but it's also more likely to turn into either a civil war or another oppressive regime taking place after you succeed. So yes, non-violence is a very serious option that has not been fully utilized by the Palestinians. But the Israelis have been very systematic in trying to crush it as well, crush their leaders, prevent their use, their attacks against civil society organizations, and they sometimes even use the Palestinian Authority itself to suppress some of this nonviolent resistance.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. I'm going to just remind everyone that we do these webinars for free. We've been averaging about 2 a month at the moment. We've got some amazing ones coming up.
Diana, your voice is garbled.
And so forth. Particular, we anyone becoming a friend. Is it well? I just or it's non-violent thinking and acting.
I think Diana has a connection problem.
I think I'm back. I hope. If you can hear me, I would just like to end on this following question. Which I am pasting in the chat for Andrew to read.
That's a very interesting question. Is nonviolence predicated on the oppressor acting rationally? That's a very interesting philosophical question, I must say. And I think there is a lot to it.
Well, I don't know that any kind of conflict is predicated on the parties acting rationally. I think people act as human beings, more likely to act irrationally than they are rationally. But nonviolence is predicated on treating your opponent as seriously as human beings.
Mm.
Nonviolent works on different battlefields. The first is the victim themselves. They have to clear their own head. They have to get rid of the oppressive, the fear. They have to think about being principled. The second battlefield is the hearts and minds of the oppressor and his soldiers and his bureaucrats and his actors to try and win them over or at least neutralize their opposition. And the third battlefield is on outside parties, the rest of the world being implicated, being involved, being brought into the oppressive situation on the side of the oppressed. So nonviolence works on all three battlefields almost simultaneously. And you're right, you can't expect everybody to act rationally. They don't always act rationally. Sometimes they lash out. I think with Israeli reaction is not entirely rational at all. Whether it's violence or non-violence, it's fed by the traumas of historical traumas of centuries and millennia of anti-Jewish bigotry culminating in the horrors of the Holocaust. It would almost be impossible to expect them to act rationally until they are healed of that trauma that they have undergone. So that's why they would react with violence, even to totally non-violent actions by the Palestinians. They view it as terrorism, as diplomatic terrorism, as economic terrorism. If you go to the international court, this is legal terrorism against us. People do not act usually rationally, whether it's to violence or non-violence.
Jonathan, I think we should probably end there. Deanna's internet connection is not so good, so I have the honor of closing this event and thanking you for participating once again. Really appreciated it very much, and reminding our audience that they can follow this again online. It'll be posted online in the next day or two. So once again, thank you to everyone for their support, and thank you, Jonathan, for participating.
Thank you.